revisit it in yet another class. And so not next semester, but maybe the semester after that, we will come back and finish up Genesis and go into the book of Exodus. For right now, we're going. Let's see, next Sunday is Easter Sunday, and so we have an all church gathering. After that, we start a new semester of equipping classes, and we will have an equipping class on church history that Rich Caskey will be doing, that will feature the early years of church history. And we'll be doing one on the Gospel of Mark that I will be doing, featuring the Gospel of Mark. And so we'll be doing that for the spring and summer. And soon after that, in another session, we'll be going back and finishing up Genesis. So we are now in Genesis chapter 38. We're glad that you could join us. We'll be looking at 38 and 39. Just an overview of what we talked about on Genesis. Remember that you've got several things going on in the book of Genesis. You've got world history in Genesis. That's 1 through 11. The history of the world, the early history of the world, down through Noah and his successors. And then after Noah, God calls out Abram from the land of Ur, and he says, Abram, I'm going to start a new nation with you. So beginning with chapter 11 all the way through the end of Genesis, what we have is the history of Israel. So if you're going to be teaching the history of Israel, it begins with Genesis chapter 11. Abram was the first Jew. There were none. And God says, I'm going to start a new nation. I will call you out of the land where you live, and I'll start a new nation with you. Now, we got a few problems here. Number one, you're childless. Number two, your wife is barren. Number three, I'm going to put you in a place where you've never been before, and we'll start it there, and I'm going to give you this land. He didn't give it to him right then. He said, "This is yours." If you've ever built a house before, maybe you had a builder who's building you one, and you're so excited when they start putting up the house. And so, I mean, when it's nothing but a lot, but that's where your house will be. You start going out and you walk through the lot, and then they put the foundation, and you walk around the foundation and say, "Oh, I think this is going to be the master bedroom," or whatever. And then they frame the house out, and you walk through it. A couple of times a week, you drive out after the workers are gone, and you walk through that house. That house you can't live there yet, but that's going to be yours. Not now. 3 months from now, you still won't be in there, but eventually that's your house. And as you walk around, you say, this will be the nursery. This will be the den. This will be the kitchen. Now, that's exactly what Abram was doing. He was walking through this land and saying, this is all mine. Not now, but it will be mine. God's giving it to me. That's what the Abrahamic covenant was. Land, seed, blessing. I'll give you this land. I'll give you a blessing. I love you so much, and I am so committed to you that not only will I bless you, but I'm even going to bless those who bless you. So the people out there who do good things for you, I'll do good things for them. I'll do good things for you. But I'll look out there and find other people doing good things for you, and I'll do good things for them because they're doing good things for you. That's the blessing. And ultimately, the ultimate blessing, the Messiah, would come from Abram. Okay? And then the seed. And he said, you're going to have children, and ultimately through your children, there will come one through whom the whole world will be blessed. So that's the next line of history in Genesis. And the third one is what we call the seed line. The seed line went all the way back to the garden when God addressed Satan and said that ultimately there will be one coming through the seed of woman. And if you'd been reading that, you'd go, whoa, what is that? What is the seed of woman? There is no, there's the seed of man, implanted in woman, but there is no seed of woman. That didn't make sense until you get to the New Testament and see that Jesus, Yeshua, was born of a virgin. And so God had it all planned out, knew what he was going to. There will become one through the seed of woman who will break your power. And so Satan knew this all the way back to the garden. He didn't know the details. He didn't know when. He didn't know exactly how it was going to work out, but he knew it would. And so as the seed line begins to take shape, Satan is doing all he can do to try to mess it up in any way he can. Okay, so those three things are going on. History of the world, history of Egypt, development of the seed, history of Israel, development of the seed line. It's all going on in the book of Genesis. One more thing. If you watched TV, like serial dramas, like cop shows and things like that, a decade or so ago, you might notice that they work differently than the way they work today. If you watch Columbo or something like that, you would go in and you would watch it, and every week there would be a new episode, and it would start afresh. So maybe you missed Columbo the first week in April. That's okay, because when you go back and get the second week in April, it's not like you won't understand it, because every week starts afresh. Same characters, but the story starts afresh. We don't do it like that anymore. If you will notice, if you watch cop shows now, there's much of the show is contained within that week. So it starts that week and it's over that week. Something happens, they catch the bad guy. But there's also other parts of the story that continue on. So you'll have a running storyline, maybe a murderer that they'll be looking for or whatever. And during this week, there's another crime, a new crime that they solve, but they advance that other storyline just a little bit. And you'll see how, in addition to solving this week's crime, we're kind of bringing you along on that other storyline that we're working on. So if you miss a week, you might have missed a part of that storyline that's going on week by week in the story. Now, that's exactly what's happening in Genesis. So, when we look today at Genesis 38 and 39, we will see a story that starts in 38 and ends in 38 with one character that you already know but don't know much about, other characters that are totally new. So there's that story that begins and ends. But there's also that big storyline that's continuing. You remember the storylines like development of Israel and the storyline of the seed line. That's going to be continuing. But there's some interesting things in this chapter. It's a chapter that you don't often hear preached about and taught about. And once we look at it, you'll see why. You know, we say that much of Genesis is like a Jerry Springer show, a telenovela, a really kind of sexy HBO show or something. I mean, that's Genesis. That's what and we're going to find that again today. And you will see from parts of this, you'll see why preachers have not typically preached on this chapter. So it could be that you've been in church for decades and you've never heard a sermon on this chapter of Genesis. And by the time we get through, you'll probably know why. So let's look at Genesis chapter 38. Let's hang in there. We're going to do 38 and 39. Remember what happened in the chapter before was Joseph had been sold into Egypt. So in 37, Joseph is taken by his brothers, sold into Egypt. Another storyline that goes through Genesis is the sovereignty of God, and you see there how God is working out His sovereignty. And you see that you don't see it in 38. In fact, things look pretty bleak. So maybe Joseph believed that God was sovereign, but next thing he knows, he's in a pit and he's being sold by his own family into slavery. And it's real easy to say, well, I believe God is sovereign. But the next thing you know, you're a part of a camel caravan heading to Egypt with a bunch of Midianites, and they're about to sell you. Yeah, I believe God's sovereign. He's going to work all this out. And he gets there and he gets sold into slavery. And, and once he gets into slavery, things start working out well, and he ends up back in jail again. And yet God is working it all out. That's the sovereignty of God that you find out in chapter after chapter. You'll see it again in chapter 38. Well, this is in the interim. Where is Joseph? In Egypt. We don't know exactly where he is at this point, but now the scene shifts from Egypt back to Canaan, and now we're going to follow the story of Judah, which is one of the brothers, is the fourth brother in Jacob's line, and we're going to follow Judah and see what's going on in his life. Judah did something in verse 31. He says, "He came about at that time that Judah departed from his brothers and visited a certain Adullamite whose name was Hira." So Judah left home. Judah left the compound. He left Israel, the brothers, and everything like that. He went out on his own, and he went hanging with Canaanites, especially his friend whose name was Hira. And Judah moved out. He left home. He went some. Why did he do that? Well, the Bible doesn't say, and we can't say about stuff that the Bible doesn't talk about for sure. But I kind of wonder if Judah was not feeling really guilty about what he and the brothers had done. I remember Judah was the one that wanted to sell him into slavery. He felt really bad about that. And one of the things, not only that, but felt bad about, because they didn't care for Joseph anyway. So even if he didn't feel for Joseph, I'm sure he felt for Jacob. Because when they came back, remember the brothers were so cagey about it. They didn't come back and say, Joseph is dead. They came back and said, we found this cloak. It looks a lot like Joseph's, and it's kind of cut up, and it's got blood all over it. Is this Joseph's coat? And, that is about as cruel as you could get to a father who loves his son. And he said, yeah, that's his coat. And he went into a funk immediately. He went into just something that lasted a long, long time, probably until he saw Joseph again, realized he was alive later on in Egypt. And maybe day after day, Judah saw what Jacob was going through. And maybe just couldn't take it. Who knows why? But for whatever reason, he moved off. Verse 2. Judah saw there was, now not only has he moved away from what had been, I guess, a happy home but wasn't anymore, but not only had he moved away and he was hanging with his friend, but he also found a wife. And he married, and we never know who this woman's name is. Her name is never mentioned. All we know is she's a daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua, and he took her and went into her. So he married this woman. Verse 3, so she conceived and bore a son, and he named him Great names. And then she conceived again and bore a son and named him Onan. She bore still another son. I was about to make a really bad joke. Decided not to. She bore still another son and named him Shelah. And it was at Chizib that she bore him. So there's 3 kids born of the Canaanite woman. There's and Onan and Shelah. And now he's got 3 kids. So he's living with the Canaanites. He has cast his lot with them instead of with his people. His best friend is a Canaanite. He has married a Canaanite. Remember the big thing with Abram, that he did not want his son marrying a Canaanite. That was and also same thing with Jacob. Uh, he went back to the old country to marry someone who was not a Canaanite. This people who God had already said, these people are under my judgment. I'm going to destroy them. I'm going to get rid of them. I'm going to give you their land. And so there was this consciousness among this growing Israel community here that that don't hang with the Canaanites because that will present problems. And so what did Judah do? He hung with the Canaanites to the extent of even marrying and having children with the Canaanite woman. Now Judah took a wife for his firstborn. Now he's so invested in the Canaanite culture now that he's got children, and he's getting spouses for his children. So I mean, Judah is now all in with, I guess, with the Canaanite culture. But Judah's firstborn, was evil in the sight of Yahweh, so Yahweh took his life. We don't know what he did. Have no idea what did that was so bad that God took his life. We know that we see from the New Testament that there are times when God does take the life of believers who have fallen significantly into sin, like Ananias and Sapphira, certainly the best known example. With taking the Lord's Supper, we've known that Paul said that there are people who have died because they've been in significant sin as they took the Lord's Supper, etc. There are times when God will take the life of a person. Whatever it was that did, he took his life. And now we come across a cultural tradition. It's called Levirate marriage, Levirate, I think. Levirate marriage. It's something that is explained later on in the Bible and was part of the Mosaic law. But even now, there were cultures who did it, and today there are cultures who do this. We tend to say this is a Bible thing, but there are cultures in the world who still do something like this. And basically the deal is, if you've got a brother who got a man who marries a woman, and the woman dies and the man is childless, then if he's got a younger brother, the younger brother takes her on, and he has a child to replace the child that his older brother did not have. And theoretically, if the younger brother number 2, marries her and he dies, then brother number 3 will take over. In fact, this was even something that came up in the New Testament, as the Sadducees, who were the religious liberals of the day, didn't believe in the afterlife, didn't believe in heaven. They said they thought they would get Jesus. So they said, let's say, here's a hypothetical Jesus. Let's say a married man marries a woman and he dies, and so his brother takes her on. He dies, 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 so his brother. There's 7 brothers who end up having this one woman, and all of them die. So, Jesus, whose wife is she in heaven? And you can read about the brilliant answer that he gave to that. But that was this custom. And so died because God took him, and Onan, now Judah said, okay, it's your responsibility to raise up an heir for your dead brother Well, now this is kind of a problem for Onan, because remember, was the firstborn, and so therefore he was going to get the firstborn rights of Judah. He's the firstborn. Remember, like with Jacob and Esau, and Esau was the firstborn. Jacob wanted to buy the firstborn rights from him. etc., and then ultimately steal the blessing from him, etc. So Er's the firstborn. He dies. Now, if Onan has a child with Er's wife, then what's going to happen is that child then will receive, I mean, he's having a child for his brother, and so it's not like, well, he's dead, so I'll get it. No. The brother, that the child that he raises up, will now have the birthright. And so Onan is not too excited about raising up a child who's going to, in effect, take over the biggest part of the inheritance from Judah. So look at what he did. Verse 8, then Judah said to Onan, go into your brother's wife and perform your duty as a brother-in-law to her and raise up offspring for your brother. Onan knew that offspring would not be his, so when he went into his brother's wife, he wasted his seed on the ground in order not to give offspring to the brother. So he had sex, but did not impregnate her. And he knew what he did was displeasing in the sight of Yahweh, so he took his life too. And so now is dead. Onan is dead. And then Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, remain a widow in your father's house till my son Shelah grows up. For he thought, I'm afraid that he too may die like his brother. So Tamar went back and lived in her father's house. So and Onan, fairly close in age. Later on, Shelah is too young to marry. So Judah says, go back to your father's house, live like a widow, and then when Shelah gets old enough, I will give her to you, and you can have the child for this family. And I imagine Judah was a little bit afraid she might be some kind of black widow kind of person or something like that. You know, it's like, okay, I got a young, healthy son. He marries this woman, dead. Got another young, healthy son, marries this woman, dead. What's she doing? You know, it wasn't what she was doing. It's what the sons were doing. And so he's a little afraid. He's got one more son left, and he's a little afraid just to get. So what he's doing is Judah thought, well, I'll outsmart her. I will hold off on giving this third son to her, and maybe by the time that he gets older, maybe something will happen to her. She will have died, or she'll be too old to have kids, or somebody else will have married, or something will happen so that my younger son does not have to marry her. Verse 12. Now after a considerable time, Shua's daughter, the wife of Judah, died. So now Judah is wifeless because his wife dies. The Canaanite woman who never gets a name in this chapter, but she's dead. And when the time of mourning was ended, Judah went up to his sheep shearers at Timnah, and he and his friend Hira the Adullamite. There's Hira again. So they're going up to shear the sheep. And this was a time of festival and celebration. And so, they sheared the sheep, but it was like a big party too. So they were at Timnah. Next time we see this word, by the way, Samson is there if you want to check that out. But they were going up there to Timnah, and it was told to Tamar, who's back living with her father, what was going on. And behold, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep. So she removed her widow's garments and covered herself in a veil and wrapped herself and sat in a gateway to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that Shelah had grown up, and she had not been given to him as a wife. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a harlot, for she had covered her face. So he turned aside to her by the road. And what she did is she dressed up, and we know from some other stuff in here, she dressed up as a temple prostitute. And this was a way of evangelism of these Canaanite. I mean, they would have women associated with the pagan temple, and it would be their job to have sex with people. And having sex with a temple prostitute was a way of worshiping that god. And so she disguised herself as one of these prostitutes. She sat down and she waited for Judah to come by. Judah, who had just lost his wife fairly recently. And so he saw her, let's see, verse 15, he saw her. He thought she was a harlot, for she had covered her face. So he turned aside to her by the road and said, "Here now, let me come in to you." For he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. And he said, "What will you give me that you may come in to me?" And Judah hadn't brought money with him. I'm sure he said, "Do you accept American Express, MasterCard, Discover, whatever?" But they couldn't come to a term. He said, "I will give you a young goat from the flock." And she said, "Will you give me a pledge?" In other words, okay, you're going to give me a young goat when the flock's sheared, but will you give me something right now so that I can know that you're going to exchange it out? He said, "Your seal and your cord," she said, "and the staff that's in your hand." Your seal would be like his ring, that like he would press that into clay or into wax or whatever as his signature. The cord would be the cord that tied the ring around his neck, and your staff, your shepherd's staff. So he gave them to her and went into her, and she conceived by him. And he arose and departed and removed her veil and put back on her widow's garment. So from that one encounter, she's pregnant, and she's pregnant with Judah's child. Verse 20, when Judah sent the young goat by his friend the Adullamite to receive the pledge from the woman's hand, he didn't find her. And he asked the men of the place, saying, "Where's the temple prostitute who was at the road by Enaim?" And they said, "There is no temple prostitute here." So he returned to Judah and said, "I didn't find her." Moreover, the men of the place said, "There is no temple prostitute here." And then Judah said, "Let her keep them. Otherwise, we will become a laughing stock. After all, I sent this young goat, but you did not find her." In other words, okay, she's not there. Let's not make a big deal out of it and go around saying, "Hey, I bought this prostitute, and now I can't find." Just hang in there. We're not going to talk about it anymore. And I'll replace the stuff. Now, it came about 3 months later that Judah was informed, "Your daughter-in-law Tamar played the harlot, and behold, she is with child by harlotry." So the word got back that Tamar was pregnant, and the patriarch in those days would have had tremendous authority, including the authority to put to death his daughter-in-law. And so Judah said, "Bring her out and let her be burned." And it's while she's being brought out that she sent to her father-in-law, saying, "I'm with child by the man to whom these things belong." And she said, "Please examine and see whose signet ring and cords and staff are these." Judah recognized them and said, "She is more righteous than I, inasmuch as I did not give her my son Shelah." And he did not have relations with her again. He realized that he was wrong and that she was right, and he took her in, and he never had sexual relations with her again. She was just a part of his family. And it came about when she was giving birth that, behold, there were twins in her womb. Moreover, it took place while she was giving birth that one put out a hand. And again, this firstborn thing would be very important. Now, this would never happen today, but if there were twins and one put out a hand, and you'd want to make sure you knew which one, because the first one to see the light of day, so to speak, is the one who is the firstborn. And so they tied a cord, a little thread around his hand, saying, "This one came out first." But it came about as he drew back his hand, behold, his brother came out. And then she said, "What a breach you have made for yourself." So he was named Perez. Again, that has to do with breach. And afterward his brother came out, who had the scarlet thread in his hand, and he was named Zerah. What's the point? There's two kids now. These are children now of Jacob, and one is Perez and one is Zerah. And the point is, when you look at Jacob, you don't look at him and say, "Boy, that's somebody I want to emulate." Jacob ran away from his family after he did all this terrible stuff with Joseph. He ran away from his family. He married a Canaanite woman. He had Canaanite kids. He was raising them in Canaanite culture. He hires a prostitute, everything like that. And yet God has chosen Judah, the tribe of Judah, as the seed line. And you see the grace of God and the sovereignty of God. And you say, you know, what could Judah do to mess things up any worse? You know, to betray his father, to betray his brother, to run away, to marry outside the faith, have children outside the faith, go into a prostitute, have an illegitimate child. And God said, you're the man. You're the man. This is the grace of God. You know, I mean, did he deserve that? Absolutely not. And yet the sovereignty of God cannot be worked around. And you see God working in the middle of all of this. Well, in the meantime, something is going on in Egypt. Some writers say that we see Joseph in 37 and Joseph in 39, and we see Joseph as a man who wants to obey God. And I've heard a writer say it's sort of like when you go in to see a uncut stone at a jeweler, they always put it on black velvet so that you can see the light coming through and everything. They never just hold it up. They always put it on that piece of black so that you can see it. This chapter is the piece of black that you put Joseph's life against, while Joseph is doing the right thing in Egypt. What's Judah doing? And so one of the things we like to do here is we like to give some of our young men the opportunity to teach, and that's exactly what's happening right now. Yevi Ivashuk is a great young teacher, and he's going to be taking you through chapter 39. Yevi, come on up. Wow, how about that?
That's interesting.
Thank you, Tommy. So we're going to be piggybacking off of Genesis 38 that Tommy was going through, and actually there are some interesting parallels that we can draw between chapter 38 and chapter 39. But we'll be looking at that more later on as we study chapter 39. So as Tommy was mentioning, Joseph comes out of his homeland. He leaves his family as he was sold to the Ishmaelites and went down to Egypt. He was sold for a cheap price, and he was sold to a man named Potiphar, who was the captain of the bodyguard down in Egypt. And Joseph, he was about 17 at that time. He was very young, and we know that this was around the reign of Senusert II and Senusert III, pharaohs of Egypt, which was around 1894 to 1878 BC, a long time ago. And something that we really see put on display in this chapter is God's aseity. I feel like we don't talk about God's aseity enough. And we talk more about sovereignty. Sovereignty relates very closely to God's aseity. But aseity is God's lack of constraint by anything, because he is above it all, he is outside of it all, and he will not be restrained by any circumstance. And we see that put on display in Joseph's life. So let's start off by reading verse 1, chapter 39. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an Egyptian officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the bodyguard bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. So Potiphar, he had a very important role. He was the bodyguard. He was in charge of protecting Pharaoh himself. And in Egyptian culture, the Pharaoh, he was the mediator for the gods to humanity. That's basically as close as you can get to becoming God on earth in Egyptians' minds. So basically, he's protecting the communication of the gods with people. And Potiphar, he had a lot on his hands. He was a wealthy guy. He owned fields, he had a big household, and he owned a bunch of slaves, and one of which is Joseph, the Hebrew slave. As we read on in the following verses, notice Joseph's positional stance in the eyes of Potiphar. In verse 2, we read, Yahweh was with Joseph, so he became a successful man. And he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. Now his master saw that Yahweh was with him, and how Yahweh caused all that he did to prosper in his hand. What's interesting is that Potiphar, he notices that everything that Joseph touches is blessed by Yahweh. I don't know completely how that looked like, but it probably looked something along the lines of ministering to Potiphar himself, talking to him about God, and declaring to him truths about God, telling him about his sovereignty in the meantime. And so Potiphar, he ties that to God's work, not crediting it to Joseph, but crediting it to God. As it says, his master saw that Yahweh was with him. It was evident by Joseph's work and by Joseph's life. And it kind of looked bleak to start off with. Joseph having been sold into slavery. You're basically at the lowest low of society. You can't get much lower than a slave. Maybe as a dead person like you, a dead person might be lower than a slave, but almost as bad, honestly. And God, he is rather merciful to him, even by leaving him as a slave, because his brothers could have killed him and left him in the pit. God spares him, and he sends him not to build pyramids, do grueling work, to be whipped and just harassed by people. He is sent to Potiphar's household. And the picture looks completely different, but God is merciful to him in that regard. And God prospered Joseph. And by prospering Joseph, he also prospered everything that was in his control, which was Potiphar's household. So as we read on, and so we'll go ahead and read verses 4 through 6. So Joseph found favor in his sight and became his personal servant. And he made him overseer over his house, and all that he owned he put in his charge. It came about that from the time he made him overseer in his house and over all that he owned, Yahweh blessed the Egyptian's house on account of Joseph. It was only through Joseph that God blessed Potiphar. Thus Yahweh's blessing was upon all that he owned, in the house and in the field. Here we see the first mention of fields. Think about it. Joseph will later stand before Pharaoh himself. And there's a crisis. There's a famine that's coming in 7 years at that time. Where does Joseph get all the experience of working with agriculture? In Potiphar's fields. Joseph had the experience and the know-how, and Potiphar entrusted everything to him. Thus Yahweh's blessing was upon all that he owned in the house and in the field. So he left everything he owned in Joseph's charge, and with him there he did not concern himself with anything except the food which he ate. Imagine that. Somebody does all the work for you, You come home, and you're like, I want a big, juicy steak. And that's all you're concerned about. You know, you're going along with your personal affairs and everything that you enjoy, you want to enjoy, you enjoy, and you have somebody that is making your household, your business successful. But it can't be all that good. We read on about the master's seductress, his wife. In verse 6b, we read, "Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance." Dangerous. Very dangerous combination. So he got the attention of Potiphar's wife. It came about after those events that his master's wife looked with desire at Joseph, and she said, "Lie with me." So she is very direct in her request to Joseph. It almost is as though she expects him to comply immediately. He is a slave, and she likely was like, he's our possession, you know, I can do whatever I want with him. And it might be that she already had experience with other servants and slaves within that household. What a nasty woman. And in verse 8 we read on, "But he refused and said to his master's wife, 'Behold, with me here my master does not concern himself with anything in the house, and he has put all that he owns in my charge. There is no one greater in this house than I, and he has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do this great evil and sin against God?' As she spoke to Joseph day after day, he did not listen to her to lie beside her or be with her." Notice that Joseph knew what to say to her as soon as the temptation came up. He already had a response for her. He already meditated on God's promises. And it kind of reminds me of 1 Peter 3:15, where Peter is saying, "Sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts, always being ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that is in you." He says, "I cannot, because my master, because God, and because it would essentially be a sin against all of you, against myself, against God. I cannot do that." And he knew what he had to say. And that is a lesson for us as well. Because when temptation comes in our lives, we can't just sort of be there scrambling in the moment, trying to, be like, wow, what do I do with this and everything? We have to think about it ahead of time. Know ourselves, know our weaknesses, and fortify it with what God has already said. And Joseph knows that God has given him blessing. And he knows that God can just as easily take that blessing away from him, just as easily as it was granted. And he knows that Potiphar's wife, she is thinking about, how can I hide this from people? How can I hide this from others? But Joseph, he's thinking, I can't hide this from God himself. I would rather not face God's wrath, but face the wrath of people instead. And we see in verse 10, it says, "As she spoke to Joseph day after day." This wasn't like some short period of time. This was a long, long time that this was happening. It could have been months, might have been years. We don't know. What we do know is that Joseph was about 17 when he came into Egypt, and when he left prison later, he was around 30. And he spent at least 2 years in prison. Let's imagine he's in his mid-20s to late 20s, so somewhere around there. But this happened over a period of time. So he had to live with this woman who was constantly coming back to him, and trying to seduce him. And as we read on, we see her final attempt. In verse 11, now it happened one day that he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the household was there inside. And that's the first alarm. There was nobody there to witness what she was about to do. In verse 12, she caught him by his garment, saying, lie with me. He left his garment in her hand and fled and went outside. I'm thinking that Joseph was probably wearing a robe here, probably a one-piece garment, and she probably snatched him by the back of his clothes and pulled it right off of him. So it was all in one piece. Joseph didn't try to struggle, didn't try to tear it out of her hand or anything. He knew himself. He knew it was better to run away from that temptation rather than to remain. And so he did. He left the garment in her hand and fled and went outside. When she saw that he had left his garments in her hand and had fled outside, she called to the men of her household and said to them, see, he has brought in a Hebrew. And he would be her husband. He has brought in a Hebrew to us to make sport of us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I screamed. When he heard that I raised my voice and screamed, he left his garment beside me and fled and went outside. So she left his garment beside her until his master came home. Notice that she tries to blame her husband. She's trying to get an emotional response here. She's trying to pent everybody up and everything, just get some people on her side. She's trying to get them angry, both at Potiphar for bringing Joseph in, and then at Joseph himself for attempting to, so to say, rape her. But I mean, her lie is pretty bad. I mean, she lied about everything except him fleeing outside, but then she also got the motive of him fleeing outside wrong. But she had the evidence, so to speak, the false evidence of the robe in her hand. We read that Potiphar, he comes home, and in verse 17, she spoke to him with these words, the Hebrew slave whom you brought to us came in to me to make sport of me, and I raised my voice and screamed. He left his garment beside me and fled outside. Basically, SparkNotes version. It was a shorter lie, but it's the same thing. And what I find interesting is that we don't read anywhere that the men of the household, they pursued Joseph, that they tried to pin him down or anything. I don't know whether they actually did, but if it's omitted, and it is omitted, and if they did not pursue him, then it shows what kind of man of character Joseph was. He was one that could be trusted, and even if he did something wrong, that he would actually own up to it. In verse 19, the master responds. Now when his master heard the words of his wife, which she spoke to him, saying, this is what your slave did to me, his anger burned. She got the emotional response out of him that she was looking for. So Joseph's master took him and put him into the jail, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in the jail. Joseph was not given any time to actually give his personal testimony. He basically, Potiphar responded in anger. His wife was angry, he got angry, and now Joseph was in prison. But think about this. Egypt followed something called Hammurabi's Code. And in Hammurabi's Code, the penalty for adultery was death. Both individuals, they were to be put to death by drowning. Both involved. And if it was rape, only that person would be drowned that raped the woman. And imagine if Joseph had not been obedient to God. And the men of the house would have caught him and Potiphar's wife. They both would have been drowned if he was disobedient. But nonetheless, Joseph chose righteousness over lust, over desire, over his passions. He chose to follow God. And in verse 21 it says, "But Yahweh was with Joseph and extended kindness to him and gave him favor in the sight of the chief jailer." I want to stop right here and reflect on the previous chapter, chapter 38, that Tommy went through in regards to Judah. And there are some parallels in those stories that are kind of in line in the timeline of the chapters. We see that, but we see different motives. Judah, he left for the people of Canaan for unrighteous reasons. He basically severed his relations with his family, or separated himself from them, and he went to somewhere where he shouldn't be, was with people that he shouldn't have been with, and did things that he shouldn't have done. Joseph, he was brought into Egypt against his will, but he followed God, and he chose righteousness even in a land that he didn't know. And he did what he was supposed to do in his response to being faithful in Potiphar's household and in not sleeping with Potiphar's wife. Judah had also become integrated with the pagan gods. We saw him where he slept with Tamar because he thought that she was a temple prostitute. He partook in a pagan festivity with the sheep shearing. It was related to fertility and whatnot. And we see that Judah, he had veered off the path of his father Jacob. Joseph followed God, and God blessed Potiphar on account of Joseph, as we read. Judah, he was stripped of his belongings to prove his guilt. And Judah, he was actually guilty. Tamar took his staff, his cord, his seal, and he was proven to be guilty in the end. Joseph, he was stripped of his robe twice. And both times it was unrightly. The first time was with his brothers, when they took it and brought his robe to his father. They presented it as evidence of his death. And the second time was with him, with Potiphar's wife, when she took that garment and presented that falsified evidence to her husband. And in all of this, both Judah and Joseph, they were humbled by their circumstances. Judah, he was broken. In order for him to start becoming a man of God, and Joseph, he was further refined. He was sanctified by God to do his good work in him. And we read on in verses 22 and 23 how God continued to bless Joseph. The chief jailer committed to Joseph's charge all of the prisoners who were in the jail, so that whatever was done there, he was responsible for it. The chief jailer did not supervise anything under Joseph's charge because Yahweh was with him. Whatever he did, Yahweh made to prosper. Imagine putting a prisoner in charge of a prison. Honestly, I can't see anything good coming out of that. It looks like chaos, I'm sure. And that's a mindless thing to do. But in this case, the jailer saw in him God. He saw that he was a trustworthy man, and he did not see anything unrighteous in Joseph. He put him in charge of the prison. And I can't help but think, Joseph, when he was over Potiphar's household, God brought blessing there. And whenever Joseph was in prison, he blessed the prison there. I wonder if Potiphar, he suffered any consequences or judgment per se after Joseph was taken out. Yes.
I wonder if Potiphar's anger didn't burn not against Joseph, but actually for the fact that his wife, whose character he knew he was well acquainted with, has this evidence, and all he cannot put his wife to give her the punishment she deserves because she's his wife. Joseph's a slave. He has to take the fall for this, because otherwise, what if this guy who's in charge of the prison, it's found out that he's elevated Joseph where Potiphar had put him to rot? And I wonder.
So for those who can't hear who are watching the video, Rob he said, what if Potiphar's anger was actually more against his wife, because she he knew her character and how she built up all the evidence, and he couldn't deny it, and he didn't really want to put Joseph in prison, but he had to with everything that she presented to him, and that's possible. Well, I mean, we're not really given enough detail. I mean, it just says his anger burned. So that is definitely a plausible explanation. I don't see why not. So, and in all of this, we see God's aseity. And it is in these chapters in Genesis, more than anything, they're not about people. They're not. It's all about God. Chapters 38 and 39 are about God. It's not about Judah. It's not about Joseph. It's about God. And it's about, I really feel the aseity of God, because what seems like brutal circumstance in our minds, God, he is able to turn it inside out and make something good out of it. We're like, this looks like a dead-end situation. I mean, how does this make any sense? But God makes something of it. He is not constrained by anything that our human minds devise. He is not limited like we are. And just as God was working in the lives of these two men, both in different ways, all of it was to make them vessels of glory for God himself. And though Scripture doesn't promise us a pain-free journey, or a journey that necessarily makes sense, what we are promised in Philippians is that God will do a sanctifying work, and he will bring it all to completion in his own time. All right, we'll go. Yes, go ahead, Rob. Oh, absolutely. Sure. Yes. Aseity. And again, that's basically God is not defined or constrained by, he is not constrained by his creation, but he is outside of it, and he is over all of it, and he is not affected, limited by it in any way. Which I said is very, very close to God's sovereignty, but this defines more of the side of his constraint, lack of being constrained, per se. All right, let's go ahead and bow our heads before God. Dear Heavenly Father, I thank you for leaving us with your scriptures, where you show us the lives of imperfect people and people that we should actually aspire to be like Joseph, where Joseph chose righteousness. He did not choose to follow his passions, any desires. He chose to follow you. And though the path is not easy, I trust that you're able to do a good work in each of us, and that you're able to use the most nonsensical of circumstance to produce a spirit of obedience and to grow in our trust in you, Father. And I ask that you would use this word, use this passage to do your work in our lives, and that we would meditate on it, that we would strive to be more godly, to seek you out, and to seek and choose righteousness. Thank you for everything that you do in us. Thank you for all the work that Christ does in us. And I ask that we would let Christ do his sanctifying work in us. I ask this all in Christ's name. Amen.